All right, everybody, we're back with part 2 of the history of Russia today. Well, a lot has happened in the last few days. The part 1 that I did was posted I think, day before Russia invaded Ukraine. And yeah, a lot has happened in the world since then. It's actually nuts. Like, literally a week ago, the world was a completely different place than it is now. Anyway, I don't think any of us knows what is going to happen over the coming, days, weeks, months, whatever, years. Hopefully this doesn't drag out that long, but I just hope that whatever happens doesn't escalate to something way worse than, the situation we have going on right now. But it is times like this when you realize how important history is, because when you have a lot of chess pieces moving in current events, what's happened in the past always influences what's going on now. And that is why I'm going through this series on Epic History TV about the history of Russia, because I don't have any historical context for that part of the world, really. I feel like I need to have some in order to better understand the current situation. And I appreciate all of your comments on the last video as well. So something that I have always done with these series that I do is I do a little something called comment time, where I pick just a handful of your comments from the previous video that we did, and I just kind of bring them up and comment on them really quickly. Now, if you don't want to watch this part, you can hit the chapter marker to the reaction and go right to that. But for the rest of you, let's take a look really quickly at some of your comments. So our first comment is from Notes, I'm not sure. They say that as a rule of thumb for European history, it always goes much further back than you think, and it's always convoluted. Yeah, I think that's a really, really good rule of thumb. Second comment is from Pierce Jackson. He says, for some context, the first Tsar of Russia, Ivan IV the Terrible, was born in 1530 and was a contemporary of Elizabeth I of England, and even proposed marriage, to which it was declined. It is interesting to know that they are contemporaries. I had no idea. It's always good when you can put things together, that happen simultaneously in history. It does help you kind of place things a little bit easier, I think. F. Rosso. The Mongols had a law that their leaders must come together when the Great Khan died to avoid civil war. Because of this, they had to stop war. After the Battle of Liegnitz, the same law saved Poland and Germany. Their troops already were seen before Vienna, and oh man, Maibian, I really have no idea how to say that. In Saxony, at the time, nobody knew that they disappeared, and the people praised God for it. There were a couple of different theories on why the Mongols left and didn't continue attacking, and they didn't come back for 14 years. There were a few that said it was because of this reason, that Khan had died and they had to, go back. One of the other reasons was given by Yakori. They say that the Mongols left for 14 years to gather more resources and consolidate their gained territory. They had no maps of the land, so it was a huge shocker that they reached some mountains after 1,000 miles of flat land and met some stiffer resistance. It goes on to say that war campaigns did in general take a long time in the 1200s, as you would generally walk the entire distance, and the crusades that were happening at the same time was also over a 10-year venture for the ones who returned. So again, here we have another simultaneous event, the crusades happening as well at the same time as this Mongol invasion was happening. So again, really helpful to kind of place that in history. So I don't know, these are two different versions of why the Mongols went back home, but I mean, they both kind of make sense. So, and lastly, we have Peter Buin, who says, you can't understand European history entirely if you don't study the Middle Ages and Middle European / German history. I did mention in the last video that the Middle Ages was kind of a period of history that I had never been particularly drawn to, and therefore really don't know anything about it. But Peter makes an excellent point. Obviously, I'm going to learn about it because he's absolutely right. You can't just skip an entire period of history, particularly one that was probably very foundational for the more modern, centuries in Europe. All right, so I'm gonna leave your comments there. Appreciate you leaving them, and I'm sure you'll be able to answer a lot of my questions on this video as well. So let's go ahead and get into it. Let's get into part 2 of the history of Russia. Now, we left off where the Russians basically were getting attacked quite a bit, and it looks like their empire might be over. So they're kind of backed into a corner here. Let's see how they get out of it.
In 1612, Russia was in a state of anarchy. They called it the Time of Troubles. The people were terrorized by war, famine, and plague. Up to a third of them perished. Foreign troops occupied Moscow, Smolensk, and Novgorod. But then, Russia fought back. Prince Pozharsky and a merchant, Kuzma Minin, led the Russian militia to Moscow and threw out the Polish garrison. Since 2005, this event has been commemorated every 4th of November as Russian National Unity Day. The Russian Assembly, the Zemsky Sabor, realized the country had to unite behind a new ruler and elected a 16-year-old noble, Mikhail Romanov, as the next Tsar. His dynasty would rule Russia for the next 300 years.
16-year-old?
Tsar Mikhail exchanged territory for peace.
Why is he so young? Why did they give power to such a young kid?
His dynasty would rule Russia for the next 300 years. Tsar Mikhail exchanged territory for peace, winning Russia much-needed breathing space. His son, Tsar Alexei, implemented a new legal code, the Sabornoye Uluzhenie. It turned all Russian peasants, 80% of the population, into serfs, effectively slaves, their status inherited by their children and with no freedom to travel or choose their master. It was a system that dominated Russian rural life for the next 200 years. The head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Nikon, imposed religious reforms that split the church between reformers and old believers. It's a schism that continues to this day. Ukrainian Cossacks, rebelling against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, recognized Tsar Alexei as overlord in exchange for his military support. It led to the 13 Years' War between Russia and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Russia emerged victorious, reclaiming Smolensk and taking control of eastern Ukraine.
So a lot of you in the comments also mentioned that Poland and Lithuania used to have this really big kingdom in Europe, which I see here on the map. So I guess, I don't know when it began, like how far back the Polish kingdom or empire or whatever goes. But okay, I'm just kind of like taking note of the year when all of this is happening so I can have some idea of when, how far back this actually goes. It's actually surprising to me. And again, this is just me being unfamiliar with European history. I can't really see, I think the Western Europe was also like this at this point. To me, 1667 feels fairly modern, at that point, the Americas were being settled over here, had a lot of European settlements happening over here in the state, or wasn't the United States yet, but in the New World. And I think of the UK as being a fairly modern sort of becoming a civilized society at this point as well. And then you had, a bunch of European empires colonizing, the rest of the world as well around this time. I guess I expected Russia and this whole area of Europe to be a bit more settled and a bit more modern looking, I guess, than it is. It still feels like it's just a bunch of uncoordinated areas of Europe that are still just like fighting for territories. There's no real, countries or anything, which I've had people in previous videos tell me that the idea of like countries with borders is actually a fairly modern thing. So it's kind of blowing my mind because in my head, going back even to the 15 or 1600s, I think of Europe as having like defined countries with borders. And that's not the case at all. You kind of just have these areas, these territories that are dominated by maybe a certain culture or ethnic group, or an empire. Ottoman Empire is down here as well. It almost looks like it's going back to like ancient times. I would think of ancient times as a map looking more like this, not the 1600s. So it really is kind of like blowing my mind right now.
Reclaiming Smolensk and taking control of eastern Ukraine. A revolt against Tsarist government, led by a renegade Cossack, Stenka Razin, brought anarchy to southern Russia. It was finally suppressed. Razin was brought to Moscow and executed by quartering. The sickly but highly educated Fyodor III passed many reforms. He abolished Mesnichestva, the system that had awarded government posts according to nobility rather than merit, and symbolically burned the ancient books of rank. But Fyodor died aged just 19. His sister Sophia became Princess Regent, ruling on behalf of her younger brothers, the joint Tsars Ivan V and Peter I.
Okay.
After centuries of conflict, Russia and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth signed a treaty of eternal peace. Russia then joined...
I'm really confused. Princess Sophia is ruling in place on behalf of her brothers? Where are her brothers? I don't understand that. I also am not understanding how these rulers are so freaking young. To me, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense for you to be ruled by a 16-year-old or 18-year-old or anything like that. I mean, I know that there have been young rulers in history, but I thought that they were the rare exception. But it seems like Russia's just like going all in on these teenagers. And it does surprise me that they had a princess, so they let a woman rule as well.
Signed a treaty of eternal peace.
So much for
Russia
that.
then joined the Holy League in its war against the Ottoman Empire. Sophia's reign also saw the first treaty between Russia and China, establishing the frontier between the two states.
Okay.
At age 17, Peter I seized power from his half-sister Sophia.
Okay.
Peter became the first Russian ruler to travel abroad. He toured Europe with his Grand Embassy, seeking allies for Russia's war against Turkey, and learning the latest developments in science and shipbuilding. The war against Turkey was successfully concluded by the Treaty of Constantinople. Russia gained Azov from Turkey's ally, the Crimean Khanate, and with it, a foothold on the Black Sea.
It's crazy because Azov is getting bombed right now. It's crazy to see these cities on here that are currently under attack. Sad, actually.
Constantinople. Russia gained Azov from Turkey's ally, the Crimean Khanate, and with it, a foothold on the Black Sea. Peter made many reforms, seeking to turn Russia into a modern European state. He demanded Russian nobles dress and behave like Europeans. He made those who refused to shave pay a beard tax. Peter built the first Russian navy, reformed the army and government, and promoted industry, trade, and education. In the Great Northern War, Russia, Poland, Lithuania, and Denmark took on the dominant power in the Baltic, Sweden. The war began.
I didn't know Sweden had a big kingdom like this either. Yeah, I'm getting a big education right here on European history. I didn't know any of this. This is just this is the 1700 at this point, and we're still on these like just big territories of kingdoms and empires here. Where I mean, no countries really exist yet. It's crazy to me. I had a completely wrong view of Europe. 1700 is not that long ago. I mean, it's just over 300 years ago at this point. Also, it's interesting, Peter the Great, I have heard about him, Russians referring back to him and stuff. So Russia really had a very different society and culture from Europe, it seems like. So Peter basically went to Europe, saw, all of the innovations that were happening there, I guess, and decided to bring it back to Russia, which I didn't know. Like, I thought that Russia just kind of like developed, sort of a European identity just by being kind of like in Europe, sort of. But I didn't realize that Western Europe was essentially like the culture of Western Europe was kind of brought back to Russia, and that's kind of what established all of that. But I understand why he's called Peter the Great now, because it sounds like he did a lot of major changes that changed the course of Russian history.
Power in the Baltic, Sweden. The war began badly for Russia with a disastrous defeat to Charles XII of Sweden at Narva. But Russia won a second Battle of Narva, before crushing Charles XII's army at the Battle of Poltava. On the Baltic coast, Peter completed construction of a new capital, St. Petersburg. The building of what would become Russia's second largest city among coastal marshes was a remarkable achievement, though it cost the lives of many thousands of serfs. The Great Northern War ended with the Treaty of Neustadt. Russia's gains at Sweden's expense made it the new dominant Baltic power. 4 years before his death, Peter was declared Peter the Great, father of his country, emperor of all the Russias.
All the Russias?
Peter was succeeded by his wife Catherine, then his grandson Peter II, who died of smallpox, aged just 14. Empress Anna Ivanovna.
I'm really baffled by all of these really young. I mean, I guess if you're in the line of succession, you're going to be in charge no matter how old you are, I suppose. But it's just nuts. Like, I had no idea that they had such young people in charge.
Aged just 14. Empress Anna Ivanovna, daughter of Peter the Great's half-brother Ivan V, was famed for her decadence and the influence of her German lover, Ernst Biron. During Anna's reign, Vitus Bering, a Danish explorer in Russian service, led the first expedition to chart the coast of Alaska. He also discovered the Aleutian Islands, and later gave his name to the sea that separates Russia and America. After Anna's death, her infant grandnephew Ivan VI was deposed by Peter the Great's daughter Elizabeth. Ivan VI spent his entire life in captivity. Until age 23, he was murdered by his guards during a failed rescue attempt. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was famed for her vanity, extravagance, and many young lovers. But she was also capable of decisive leadership. In alliance with France and Austria, Elizabeth led Russia into the 7 Years' War against Frederick the Great of Prussia. The Russian army inflicted a crushing defeat on Frederick at the Battle of Kunersdorf, but failed to exploit its victory.
So the 7 Years' War, obviously I've seen that around a lot. I feel like it's something that we probably would have learned about in history class. But again, it's like, I don't really remember it. So that's another thing I'm going to have to learn about is the 7 Years' War, because I have no idea what it was about, really.
On Frederick at the Battle of Kunersdorf, but failed to exploit its victory. Meanwhile, in St. Petersburg, the Winter Palace was completed at vast expense.
Jeez,
it would remain the monarch's official residence right up until the Russian Revolution of 1917. Peter III was Peter the Great's grandson by his elder daughter Anna Petrovna, who died as a consequence of childbirth. Raised in Denmark, Peter spoke hardly any Russian and greatly admired Russia's enemy, Frederick the Great. So he had Russia swap sides in the 7 Years' War, saving Frederick from almost certain defeat. Peter's actions angered many army officers, and he'd always been despised by his German wife, Catherine. Together, they deposed Peter III, who died a week later in suspicious circumstances. His wife, Catherine, became Empress of Russia. Her reign would be remembered as one of Russia's most glorious. Epic History TV.
Just gonna leave me there, huh? I was looking forward to, like, why is Catherine's reign so glorious? Okay, so key takeaways from all of that. Russia really likes really young rulers, teenagers especially. They had way more women rulers than I thought that they had. Actually, I had no idea that they even had any female rulers. That's kind of interesting to me. And yeah, the map of Europe, totally different from what I have always had in my head. I'm kind of starting to see the relationship that Russia has had with Europe. You know, the beginnings of that, I guess, when Peter the Great went over to Western Europe, toured, got allies for his war against Turkey, kind of seeing the history of Russia and China. But I don't really know the full history between China and Russia, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Obviously, Russia and Turkey have always kind of been at odds with each other. It seems like, I mean, again, I don't know the full history, but so I'm starting to see some of the historical, you know, relationships that Russia has had with Europe, which kind of helps put a little bit of what's happening now into context. But again, we've got another 200-300 years, you know, to fill in here, so I'm sure there's a lot that happens. And looking forward to seeing what Catherine the Great's, you know, reign did for Russia. So anyway, yeah, these videos have been really, really good, really eye-opening for me as well. Hope you guys have enjoyed it. Be sure to leave a comment down below answering my questions, you know, leaving some more info on some of the stuff that I was a little bit ambiguous about. That'd be great. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe. You can also check my description and pinned comment in this video for links to my social media, Patreon, and my Star Trek podcast. If you guys are Trekkies and want to check that out. And you know what? Roger never even said, hey, I guess we're at the end of the video now, so maybe say bye, Roger. Okay, so you're just gonna be cute now, huh? Alright, well, there we go. Stay tuned for part 3 coming up here, and we'll see you next time.